The night before the storm broke, the Normandy coast slept beneath a low, sullen sky. The wind carried the smell of rain and seaweed, sweeping through barbed wire and concrete pillboxes that dotted the shoreline like ancient tombs. Inside one of them sat Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had learned long ago that quiet was the most deceptive sound of war. For weeks he had listened to that silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic pulse of waves and the occasional whine of a generator somewhere down the line. Reports from intelligence spoke of an Allied invasion, but to most officers it had become a ghost story told too many times. The Atlantic Wall stood ready, or so Berlin insisted, 4,000 miles of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler called it the Shield of Europe. The propaganda reels showed smiling soldiers drilling on sunny beaches. But in Richter's bunker the air was damp, the walls cracked, and the ammunition stores were half what the manuals required. At 32, Richter was too young to be disillusioned and too old to believe. He kept his men sharp, young conscripts mostly, and a few veterans pulled from the ruins of the Eastern campaigns. They trained, logged targets, and stared out into the fog. To them, the Channel was an empty horizon. To him, it was a wound waiting to open. Just after midnight on June 6, the wind shifted. The storm that had battered the coast for 2 days finally eased, leaving the air heavy and electric. Richter stepped outside his post, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon. The sea was restless, choppy under a fading moon. He could hear the distant roll of thunder, or perhaps something else, something metallic. By 4:30 a.m., the mist began to thin. From his elevated observation post near Colville-sur-Mer, Richter noticed a faint smear on the horizon, dark, low, and impossibly vast. He adjusted his Zeiss optics and his pulse quickened. The smear resolved into shapes, one then 10, then 100. At first he thought it must be a convoy, perhaps a supply flotilla or a training exercise, but as dawn approached, the sea itself seemed to transform. The line of ships grew thicker, spreading across the entire horizon. It was not a fleet, it was a continent of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports stretched so far that the curvature of the earth could not contain them. Richter's mouth went dry. He lowered the binoculars, blinked, then raised them again. It was real. The invasion they'd whispered about for years was no longer a rumor. It was a wall of metal and men advancing silently toward the beaches. He reached for the field telephone, his hand trembling slightly as he reported what he saw. "Observation Post 4, he said. "The sea is covered with ships, thousands. The invasion has begun." The call reached regimental headquarters, but disbelief traveled faster than orders. On the other end of the line, a weary staff officer dismissed Richter's report as nerves or fog illusions. The weather, after all, had been too rough for any invasion attempt. German meteorologists had guaranteed it, yet outside the horizon was no longer gray water. It was alive, moving, breathing in steel. Richter slammed the receiver down and tried another frequency, bypassing protocol. Static hissed, voices crackled, and finally a connection opened. "Thousands of ships," he repeated. "It's not a raid, it's the invasion." This time his urgency pierced through skepticism. Permission to fire was granted, but not yet confirmed. The chain of command, so rigidly built on discipline and order, hesitated under the weight of the unthinkable. In Berlin, High Command still believed the main assault would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between France and England. For months, Allied deception had reinforced that illusion. Dummy armies filled the English countryside. Inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, and General Patton's fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group convinced German intelligence that Normandy was merely a diversion. The operation was called Fortitude, and it worked with surgical precision. On that June morning, the men who should have been guarding Normandy's beaches were stationed 100 miles away, waiting for an invasion that would never come. From his observation post near Colville, Richter saw the reality unfold. The mist had lifted completely now, revealing the largest armada in human history, nearly 7,000 ships carrying over 156,000 Allied soldiers. Battleships like USS Texas and HMS Warspite loomed on the outer edge, their guns already turning toward the French coast. Closer to shore, destroyers and landing craft maneuvered in dense formations, each moving with mechanical precision. Richter's artillery battery, 4 105 field guns set into concrete emplacements, had drilled for this moment. Coordinates were fixed, distances calculated, ammunition stacked in neat pyramids. Yet the sheer magnitude of what confronted them shattered all preparation. Even as his men loaded the first shells, a strange silence filled the bunker, the collective pause before history itself exhaled. At 5:58 a.m., Richter gave the order. The first shell thundered out, its echo rolling across the cliffs. A second followed, then a third. The battery came alive in mechanical rhythm, a German metronome pounding against the sea. Through his binoculars, he tracked the explosions. Columns of spray erupted among the landing craft. For a moment he believed they had scored hits. But as the smoke drifted, the fleet did not falter. Gaps closed instantly, the formation undisturbed. Then came the reply. Low and distant at first, a sound more felt than heard, the battleships had begun to answer. The ground trembled as naval guns, some firing shells weighing over a ton, unleashed their barrage. The sky lit up with flashes that seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. Within seconds, Richter's own position was engulfed in shockwaves and dust. Concrete shuddered, steel vibrated, and the myth of the Atlantic Wall began to crumble. For the men inside the bunkers, the world became noise and dust. Every detonation felt like the earth itself was cracking open. Richter steadied himself against the trembling wall, shouting commands through the roar. Communication lines flickered, then died altogether as shellfire ripped through the trenches and wire networks. They were alone now, an island of resistance amid a sea of annihilation. The bombardment was methodical, almost industrial. Allied naval fire didn't come as random chaos. It came as a calculated rhythm, section by section, gun by gun, bunker by bunker. Battleships like USS Arkansas and HMS Rodney fired in coordinated volleys, guided by spotters and aircraft overhead. Some shells landed short, sending geysers of water high into the air. Others struck true, turning reinforced concrete into splintered rubble. In under 30 minutes, over 3,000 heavy shells had been fired along the 5 designated landing beaches. It was not just an attack, it was the dismantling of a fortress. Richter's battery survived the first wave, though one gun was buried under debris. The crew worked feverishly to clear it, coughing through clouds of powdered cement. In the haze, Richter caught glimpses of the sea still full, still coming. Through his optics, he saw the next act of the invasion unfold. The landing craft had begun their run toward the shore, moving through the churned gray water like swarms of insects drawn toward the fire. Each vessel carried 30 men, some crouched in prayer, others gripping their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white. Behind them, support ships unloaded tanks, bulldozers, and amphibious trucks, an army of machines designed to climb beaches, clear obstacles, and carve roads in hours. By 6:30 a.m., the first Higgins boats scraped the sand at Omaha in Utah. Ramp doors dropped and American infantry poured out into hell. Machine guns from the German strongpoints opened up, cutting into the first waves. Richter could see the chaos through binoculars, men falling before they reached the waterline, others dragged down by the weight of their gear. The surf turned red, bodies floating like driftwood. It was carnage beyond comprehension. For a moment, the defense appeared to hold. The 352nd Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of coastal battalions, pinned down the Americans. Pillboxes were still active and mortars rained on the crowded beach. From Richter's vantage point, it seemed possible that the Atlantic Wall might yet fulfill its purpose. But deep down he knew the truth. He was watching not victory, but delay. Behind the smoke, Allied destroyers began to move closer, disobeying standing orders to stay offshore. Some ventured within 1,000 yards of the beach, so near their hulls scraped sandbars. Their guns fired directly at the bunkers, using line-of-sight targeting. Precision fire turned pillboxes into shattered shells. The defenders fought with discipline, but the math of the battle had turned against them. For every gun the Germans manned, the Allies had 10. For every bunker destroyed, more firepower replaced it within minutes. The Atlantic Wall was not falling because it was weak. It was falling because it had never been built to withstand a nation's entire industrial output aimed at one shoreline. By mid-morning, the horizon had vanished behind a curtain of smoke. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and burning oil, a mixture that would linger in memory long after the guns went silent. Inside his observation post, Richter could taste grit on his tongue. The glass of his binoculars was cracked, yet he kept scanning, refusing to look away from the unfolding catastrophe. What struck him most was not the ferocity of the Allied assault, but its organization. Everything seemed synchronized, from the timing of the naval bombardment to the waves of landing craft that followed. He realized then that this was not merely an army attacking a beach. It was an industrial process executed with the precision of assembly lines. Each phase of the invasion was designed to replace the losses of the last ships, tanks, men in an unbroken chain. Allied air power deepened that impression. The morning sky roared with thousands of engines as bombers and fighter bombers crisscrossed overhead. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. In all of France that day, barely 300 German aircraft managed to take off, many destroyed before reaching the coast. The Allies, by contrast, flew over 14,000 sorties. It was complete domination. Every German position that dared show movement risked annihilation from above. Richter's world shrank to the bunker's concrete walls. Shell fragments rattled against the embrasure. His gun crews fired in short, controlled bursts, changing positions after every few rounds. They still fought with discipline, but ammunition was dwindling. The nearest resupply depot was 30 kilometers inland, and every road between was under attack by Allied aircraft. Even if reinforcements existed, they could not reach him. He thought briefly of Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had warned Berlin of this very moment. Rommel's reports had been clear. If the Allies ever landed in force, they must be defeated on the beaches within 24 hours or the war in the West would be lost. But Rommel was in Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced the weather made an invasion impossible. It was a cruel irony. The storm that had delayed the Allies had also lulled the defenders into complacency. At 9 a.m., Richter's artillery position was nearly surrounded. Allied naval gunfire had silenced the neighboring batteries. The command post to his right had gone dark. Through the haze, he could see American engineers advancing up the beach, clearing mines with Bangalore torpedoes, long metal tubes shoved into the sand and detonated to carve narrow lanes through the defenses. Behind them came tanks, some equipped with spinning flails that beat the earth, setting off mines before they could claim a life. Others, the so-called Hobart's funnies, carried bridges, flamethrowers, or amphibious tracks. The Germans had no such marvels. They fought with courage but not innovation, and in war courage without adaptability becomes a slow death. Richter watched as Allied units pushed inland, their movement relentless, almost mechanical. Each minute brought another reminder that this was not the Normandy Germany had prepared to defend, it was the front line of a new kind of warfare, one powered not by ideology but by mass production. By late morning, Richter's world had narrowed to instinct, the repetition of commands, the thunder of guns, the ceaseless impact of shells shaking the floor beneath his boots. The once organized symphony of defense had degenerated into isolated fragments. Communications were gone, flank units obliterated, and the chain of command reduced to whoever could still speak through the dust. Yet he continued to observe, because that was all that remained of his duty: to see, to report, to bear witness. From his slit window, he could just make out the American landing craft disgorging wave after wave of soldiers. The tide was literally bringing in an army. By now, bulldozers were already clearing wreckage from the beach, tanks were grinding over obstacles once considered impassable, and medics were setting up aid stations behind piles of shattered concrete. The beachhead, that crucial foothold, had formed, and no amount of German resistance could erase it. To the west, near Point du Hoc, he saw plumes of smoke rising where U.S. Rangers had scaled the cliffs under machine gun fire to neutralize the artillery batteries threatening Omaha and Utah beaches. Those guns, his guns, were supposed to crush any attempt to land, but they had been moved inland days earlier, hidden under camouflage. The Rangers found them and destroyed them within hours. Another pillar of the Atlantic Wall collapsed. As Richter watched, he began to understand something deeper than the loss of a battle. What he saw through those cracked lenses was the death of an idea, the idea that fortifications, ideology, or even courage could hold back a system that had turned war into an exact science. The Allies were not improvising, they were executing a plan tested and refined through years of logistics and production. Consider the scale. The Allies had constructed Mulberry Harbors, artificial ports built in England, dismantled and towed across the Channel. Each section weighed thousands of tons, yet by the end of D+1 they were reassembled on the Normandy coast, allowing trucks and tanks to roll directly onto French soil. Beneath the sea, engineers had laid underwater pipelines, Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, ensuring a constant flow of fuel from Britain to France. Every soldier, every bullet, every tank had a place in a grand equation of efficiency. Germany had no answer to that. Its panzers, formidable on open ground, were trapped by Allied air supremacy. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, received its orders too late, bogged down by conflicting messages and Hitler's refusal to release armored reserves without his personal approval. By the time the panzers reached the battlefield, the sky was alive with Allied fighter bombers. The result was slaughter before a single tank reached the coast. Inside the bunker, Richter felt the futility settle like ash. He was part of a war that could no longer be won, not by tactics or heroism. Germany had entered a conflict of factories and failed to notice when the front lines shifted from trenches to assembly lines. The world outside had changed, and for the men inside those bunkers, it was already too late to catch up. By afternoon, the thunder had become a steady drumbeat, the heartbeat of a continent waking under fire. The invasion was no longer a question of if or where. It was unfolding in full, unstoppable momentum. The beaches that morning had been killing grounds. By midday they were ports. Columns of men and machines poured inland, following chalk-marked paths cleared by engineers. The Allies had transformed chaos into order within hours, a feat that stunned even their own commanders. From his shattered post, Richter could no longer tell where the front began or ended. The sky was a moving canopy of aircraft, waves of C-47 transports and gliders trailing white parachutes across the countryside. Behind enemy lines, tens of thousands of paratroopers were already cutting communication cables, seizing crossroads, and isolating the German defenses one by one. It was war conducted with a precision that bordered on automation. By 3 p.m., Richter's last telephone line went dead. He had no orders, no contact, only the rhythmic thunder of artillery echoing through the concrete. His surviving gun crews were deafened, their uniforms streaked with grime and blood. He walked among them like a ghost commander, shouting over the noise, directing fire at distant smoke columns that no longer mattered. Every shell they fired was an act of defiance rather than strategy. Outside, the Allies were advancing beyond the beaches. American units under General Omar Bradley had begun pushing toward Vierville and Colville. To the east, British and Canadian forces were breaking through at Gold, Juno, and Sword. The once mighty Atlantic Wall was now little more than isolated pockets of resistance, bunkers still fighting out of pride or disbelief. The Reich's Fortress Europe had turned into a graveyard of its own myths. Richter stepped out of the bunker briefly, blinking against the haze. The landscape that had once been serene farmland now looked lunar, scorched earth, craters, wrecked armor, and the wreckage of an entire worldview. Overhead, Allied planes flew in perfect formation, uninterrupted. He thought of the promises carved into every speech from Berlin, that Germany's willpower could overcome any odds, that its soldiers could hold the line forever. But staring at the horizon filled with Allied ships, he saw not willpower but production, the factories of Detroit, Manchester, and Pittsburgh marching together under one flag. He understood then that this was not the failure of a single army but of an entire philosophy. The Reich had built walls, the Allies had built bridges. The Reich had worshipped discipline, the Allies had mastered logistics. For every bunker destroyed, another bridgehead emerged. For every man lost, replacements already crossed the sea behind him. This was not a battle between armies, it was a confrontation between eras. By nightfall, Richter's battery was gone. The last gun fell silent as ammunition ran out. He sat against the bunker wall, ears ringing, staring at the darkening sea that still glittered with the reflections of ships. The day had begun with silence and ended in revelation. The Reich's illusion of dominance had dissolved with the tide. For Richter and thousands like him, June 6, 1944 was not merely D-Day. It was the day they saw the old world end, when a single dawn over Normandy revealed the might of modern war and the inevitability of defeat.